Did you ever wonder what lurks behind the polished facades of Hollywood's greatest stars? While we celebrate the talents and achievements of Golden Age actors, an uncomfortable truth remains hidden in plain sight. Some of these legendary figures weren't exactly intellectual powerhouses. Behind the glamour, the scripted lines, and the carefully crafted public images existed individuals whose natural mental capacities ranged from surprisingly average to genuinely below par. Today, we pull back the curtain on this rarely discussed aspect of cinema history. George Raft. George Raft embodied the quintessential Hollywood gangster during the 1930s and 1940s, with his slick appearance and iconic coin-flipping routine first showcased in 1932's Scarface. Born in Hell's Kitchen, New York, Raft's real-life connections to notorious gangsters like Bugsy Siegel and Oni Madden lent authenticity to his on-screen personas. Before finding fame in Hollywood, he worked as a dancer in nightclubs and eventually on Broadway, where his lightning-fast Charleston caught attention and led him to California. What most audiences didn't realize was that behind Raft's smooth gangster image was a man whose intellectual limitations significantly impacted his career. One screenwriter who worked on Scarface observed Raft's self-awareness about his limited acting abilities, noting he realized he wasn't a good actor, which he wasn't, but he knew if he reacted to what other people said, he was effective. This understanding of his limitations led Raft to develop the now iconic coin-flipping gimmick as a way to make his character memorable despite his restricted range. Raft's poor decision-making became legendary in Hollywood circles. In perhaps the most notorious example of career self-sabotage in film history, Raft turned down leading roles in High Sierra, The Maltese Falcon, and Casablanca, all films that subsequently transformed Humphrey Bogart from a supporting player into one of cinema's greatest stars. A contemporary columnist described Raft as Hollywood's authority on walkouts, referencing his habit of refusing roles and clashing with studio executives, often to his own detriment. On set, Raft's intellectual limitations manifested in sometimes comical ways. During filming of The Bowery with Wallace Beery, Raft agreed to let Beery throw the first punch in a fight scene. Having been a boxer in his youth, Raft should have known better. Beery knocked him unconscious with a single blow. When Raft finally regained consciousness, he wanted to fight Beery for real, requiring crew members to keep them separated to prevent further injury. Hardly the behavior of a thoughtful professional. Despite his limitations, Raft found a formula that worked for him, playing tough guys with minimal dialogue and maximum menace. His restrictions as an actor inadvertently created his signature style: economical movements, understated reactions, and a perpetually suspicious demeanor. These became Raft trademarks not because they were artistic choices, but because they represented the full extent of his capabilities. As his career progressed, he increasingly relied on his established persona rather than attempting to expand his range. In his later years, Raft's reputation as a performer with limited intelligence followed him, culminating in roles that essentially parodied his earlier gangster image. His appearance in Billy Wilder's Some Like It Hot, 1959, found him playing Spats Columbo, a character who is essentially a caricature of his earlier tough guy roles. By this point, even Raft seemed to acknowledge the narrow parameters of his talent, leaning into the very limitations that had both defined and constrained his career for decades. Raft's story serves as a fascinating case study of how even significant intellectual limitations couldn't prevent success in Golden Age Hollywood. His natural screen presence, authentic connections to the criminal underworld, and instinctive understanding of his own limitations allowed him to craft a memorable persona that, despite his obvious shortcomings, secured him a place in cinema history. Perhaps inadvertently, George Raft proved that in Hollywood, Being self-aware about one's limitations can sometimes be more valuable than raw intelligence. Johnny Weissmuller. Before Johnny Weissmuller ever set foot on a movie set, he had already achieved incredible fame as one of the greatest swimmers in Olympic history, winning 5 gold medals and setting numerous world records. Born in what is now Romania, Weissmuller immigrated to the United States as a child and discovered his extraordinary natural talent in the water. This athletic prowess caught Hollywood's attention, leading to his casting as Tarzan in a role that would define him for generations. While Weissmuller's physical gifts were undeniable, his intellectual capabilities were notably limited. With minimal formal education, having dropped out of school at a young age, Weissmuller struggled with basic academics. His difficulties with reading and comprehensive learning were open secrets in Hollywood, where directors learned to provide him with the simplest possible dialogue. His famous Tarzan yell became a convenient substitute for actual lines, and his limited vocabulary in the role, "Me Tarzan, you Jane," wasn't entirely acting. MGM executives quickly realized that keeping Weissmuller's dialogue to a minimum wasn't just stylistically appropriate for the character of Tarzan, but necessary given the actor's limitations. During script development for the Tarzan films, writers were instructed to craft scenes that showcased Weissmuller's impressive physicality while demanding minimal verbal performance. The resulting characterization, a man of few words but extraordinary physical prowess, perfectly masked Weissmuller's real-life limitations behind a character trait. Co-stars and crew members from the Tarzan films often commented on Weissmuller's struggles with remembering even his sparse dialogue. Maureen O'Sullivan, who played Jane opposite his Tarzan, developed a system of subtle cues to help Weissmuller remember when to deliver his lines. These accommodations were made without malice, as Weissmuller's natural charm and agreeable personality made him well-liked, despite his intellectual challenges. Many who worked with him described him as kind-hearted but extraordinarily simple-minded. After his Tarzan series ended, Weissmuller's limitations became even more apparent when he attempted the Jungle Gym film series. These roles required slightly more dialogue and character development, areas where Weissmuller continued to struggle. Directors maintained techniques developed during the Tarzan era, keeping his lines brief and action sequences plentiful. The contrast between Weissmuller and more verbally adept actors became increasingly obvious as his career progressed. In his personal life, Weissmuller's intellectual challenges contributed to his difficulties managing finances and relationships. Despite earning substantial sums during his Hollywood career, he experienced significant financial problems later in life, partly due to his inability to understand complex financial matters and tendency to trust questionable advisors. His 5 marriages and numerous personal difficulties suggested a man who struggled with judgment and decision-making beyond the structured environment of a movie set. Johnny Weissmuller's legacy demons: how Golden Age Hollywood could transform even significant intellectual limitations into marketable characteristics. By crafting a character that made virtue of simplicity and physical prowess, filmmakers created one of cinema's most enduring icons while accommodating an actor whose natural intelligence would have otherwise prevented a successful acting career. Weissmuller may not have understood the complexities of filmmaking, but his natural physical gifts and agreeable personality allowed him to become a cultural phenomenon despite his limitations. Vera Hruba Ralston. Vera Hruba Ralston's path to Hollywood stardom began on the ice rinks of her native Czechoslovakia, where she competed as a figure skater, even representing her country in the 1936 Winter Olympics. Her athletic grace and striking appearance caught the attention of Republic Pictures studio head Herbert J. Yates during an ice show tour of America. What happened next demonstrates how power, infatuation, and stubbornness could override common sense in Golden Age Hollywood, even when a performer's limitations were glaringly obvious. Yates became so enamored with Ralston that he made her his personal project, determined to transform the skater into a major film star despite overwhelming evidence of her unsuitability for acting. The most glaring obstacle was Ralston's extremely limited English skills and thick accent, which made her dialogue nearly incomprehensible to American audiences. Rather than recognizing this fundamental issue, Yates insisted on pushing her into increasingly prominent roles, often at the expense of more talented contract players. Beyond her language difficulties, Ralston displayed a startling lack of acting instinct or ability to improve with training and experience. Critics were merciless, with one famously writing that she skated through her dramatic scenes with all the emotional depth of a frozen puddle. Another reviewer noted that she delivered lines as if she were reading them phonetically off cue cards, which, in fact, she often was. Despite years of coaching, acting lessons, and numerous film opportunities, Ralston showed virtually no improvement in her performances. What made Ralston's case particularly notable was Yates's willingness to sacrifice Republic Pictures' financial stability and reputation to promote his favorite. The studio head forced directors to cast Ralston in films where she was clearly mismatched with the material, and demanded that editors give her more screen time than her performances warranted. Established stars like John Wayne and Judy Garland reportedly refused to work with Republic specifically to avoid being paired with Ralston in what they knew would be career-damaging productions. Behind the scenes, Ralston's intellectual limitations extended beyond acting abilities. Production crews found they needed to explain even basic concepts repeatedly, and directors developed elaborate systems to guide her through scenes. One technique involved placing numbered markers on the floor and giving Ralston a corresponding list of emotions to display when she reached each number. A method that produced mechanical, disconnected performances that audiences found jarring and unnatural. The ultimate indication of Ralston's limitations came when Yates, now her husband, finally acquiesced to reality and allowed her career to end after years of box office failures and critical drubbings. In retirement, Ralston demonstrated little understanding of why her acting career had failed so spectacularly, often suggesting in interviews that jealousy or prejudice against her European background had been the primary obstacles rather than her fundamental lack of talent and intelligence for the profession. Vera Hruba Ralston's Hollywood story serves as perhaps the most extreme example of how power and personal relationships could override obvious evidence of intellectual unsuitability in Golden Age cinema. Despite every indication that she lacked the basic intelligence and aptitude needed for acting success, Yates's determination pushed her into a decade-long career that became synonymous with wooden performances and box office poison. Her case illustrates how even the most obvious limitations could be temporarily overcome by the sheer force of studio power. Lana Turner's discovery at Schwab's Pharmacy, or the Top Hat Cafe, depending on which Hollywood legend you believe, has become one of cinema's most famous rags-to-riches stories. Her stunning beauty and undeniable screen presence quickly elevated her to stardom at MGM, where she became one of the studio's most reliable box office attractions. Behind the glamorous facade, however, was a woman whose intellectual limitations significantly impacted both her professional work and tumultuous personal life. From the beginning of her career, directors and co-stars noted Turner's struggles with understanding complex dialogue or script analysis. MGM quickly developed strategies to accommodate these limitations, providing her with coaches who would break down scripts into simpler components and focusing her roles on projecting emotion rather than delivering intellectual content. Her greatest successes came in melodramas and noir films, where her natural ability to convey strong emotions, particularly desire, anger, and fear, overshadowed her limited range and comprehension. Turner's on-set behavior often reflected her intellectual challenges. She became known for requiring an extraordinary number of takes for even simple scenes, not out of perfectionism, but because she struggled to remember lines or understand direction. Co-star Kirk Douglas once remarked that working with Turner was like trying to explain calculus to someone who's still learning addition. However, Douglas and others also acknowledged that once Turner grasped what was needed emotionally from a scene, she could deliver powerful performances despite her comprehension difficulties. In her personal life, Turner's intellectual limitations manifested in a string of disastrous romantic relationships and financial decisions. Married 7 times, she displayed a pattern of impulsive decision-making and an inability to learn from previous mistakes. Her notorious relationship with mobster Johnny Stompanato, which ended with his fatal stabbing by her teenage daughter in self-defense, demonstrated a profound lack of judgment and inability to recognize obvious danger signs that others in her circle had repeatedly warned her about. Turner's difficulties with financial management became increasingly apparent as her career progressed. Despite earning substantial sums during her peak years, she experienced significant financial problems, often signing contracts without understanding their terms or making impulsive purchases without considering consequences. Studio executives at MGM established special provisions to protect Turner from her own financial decisions, essentially creating a trust-like arrangement to ensure her long-term security despite her poor judgment. What saved Turner's career despite these limitations was her remarkable instinctive understanding of her own image and how to present herself on camera. Though she struggled with intellectual matters, she possessed an almost preternatural awareness of how lighting, costume, and camera angles could enhance her appearance. Cinematographers noted that Turner instinctively knew her best angles without being able to articulate why they worked, positioning herself for maximum visual impact through what appeared to be pure instinct rather than calculated understanding. Lana Turner's story illustrates how natural beauty, screen presence, and emotional instinct could overcome significant intellectual limitations in Golden Age Hollywood. While her difficulties with comprehension and decision-making created challenges throughout her life, her natural gifts allowed her to build a legendary career that spanned decades. In an industry that often valued appearance over intellect, especially for women, Turner's limitations became almost irrelevant in the face of her overwhelming visual appeal and emotional authenticity on screen. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe's transformation from Norma Jean Mortensen to America's most iconic sex symbol has been exhaustively documented, but misconceptions about her intelligence persist decades after her death. The popular narrative often portrays Monroe as a dumb blonde, whose screen persona reflected her real intellectual capacity. The truth, however, is considerably more complex and challenges our understanding of both intelligence and perception in Golden Age Hollywood. Monroe's limited formal education, she never completed high school, and early life experiences certainly created gaps in her knowledge. She often struggled with punctuality, memorization, and following complex instructions, behaviors that led many colleagues to dismiss her as unintelligent. Her notorious difficulty with remembering lines and frequent tardiness on set reinforced this perception, driving directors like Billy Wilder to exasperation, despite their recognition of her extraordinary screen presence. What distinguishes Monroe from others in this examination is that beneath these surface limitations lay evidence of significant intellectual curiosity and emotional intelligence. Her personal library contained over 400 books, many annotated with her adjustments and character motivations that significantly improved scenes, yet she struggled to articulate these ideas in ways that garnered respect from male colleagues. Her famous line, "Diamonds are a girl's best friend," was delivered with a precisely calibrated irony that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the character's motivations. Yet many viewed it merely as a sexy woman singing about jewelry. What made Monroe's case particularly tragic was her awareness of how others perceived her intelligence and her unsuccessful attempts to change that perception. After establishing her own production company, itself a sign of business acumen rare among actresses of her era, Monroe deliberately sought more challenging roles that would showcase depths beyond her bombshell image. These efforts were consistently undermined by an industry that valued her more as a sex symbol than as a complete performer with intellectual contributions to offer. Monroe's struggles with mental health issues, including anxiety and depression, further complicated perceptions of her intelligence. Her emotional difficulties often manifested as behavior that reinforced stereotypes about her intellectual limitations, appearing confused, disconnected, or overwhelmed in professional situations. The medication she used to manage these conditions frequently affected her cognitive functioning, creating a vicious cycle where treatment for her emotional struggles further undermined perceptions of her intellectual capacity. Marilyn Monroe represents a unique case in our examination. Not someone who was genuinely limited intellectually, but rather someone whose intelligence took forms not readily recognized or valued in Hollywood's male-dominated environment. Her struggle to have her intellectual contributions acknowledged despite her undeniable sex appeal highlights how deeply beauty and brains were considered mutually exclusive for women during the Golden Age. In the final analysis, Monroe's greatest limitation may not have been her intelligence, but rather an industry that refused to recognize the complexity behind her carefully constructed facade. Ronald Reagan. Long before he occupied the Oval Office, Ronald Reagan built a solid, if unspectacular, career as a film actor during Hollywood's Golden Age. After beginning as a radio sports announcer, Reagan's pleasant appearance and clear speaking voice landed him a contract with Warner Brothers in 1937. Throughout his two-decade film career, Reagan appeared in over 50 films, establishing himself as a reliable, if somewhat limited, performer whose intellectual capabilities both helped and hindered his Hollywood trajectory. Unlike some actors on this list, Reagan possessed basic intellectual competence. He had graduated from college and demonstrated adequate verbal skills. However, those who worked with him in Hollywood consistently noted his intellectual incuriosity and tendency to accept information without critical examination. Directors found that Reagan would dutifully memorize lines and hit marks, but rarely questioned character motivations or suggested script improvements. This made him easy to work with, but limited his growth as an actor. Reagan's defining intellectual characteristic in Hollywood was his remarkable ability to absorb and repeat information without necessarily understanding its deeper implications. This trait served him well when delivering studio-approved talking points to fan magazines or at public appearances, but resulted in performances that critics often described as wooden or one-dimensional. Co-star Bette Davis famously remarked that working with Reagan was like acting with a mannequin, pleasant-looking, but nothing behind the eyes. The roles that best suited Reagan's limitations were straightforward, morally uncomplicated characters that aligned with his natural persona. His most successful performances came in films like King's Row, 1942, where his character's emotional journey remained within clear, simple parameters. When cast in roles requiring greater complexity or moral ambiguity, Reagan's limitations became more apparent, as he struggled to convey the internal conflicts that more intellectually engaged actors could portray with nuance. Reagan's political development during his Hollywood years provides interesting insights into his intellectual approach. As his politics shifted from New Deal Democrat to conservative Republican, Colleagues noted that he adopted new positions with absolute certainty, despite minimal study or consideration of opposing viewpoints. This pattern, absorbing simplified versions of complex ideas and repeating them with complete conviction, would later become a hallmark of his political career, but limited his artistic growth in Hollywood. Perhaps the most telling aspect of Reagan's Hollywood intelligence was his genuine contentment with his mid-tier status. Unlike more ambitious actors who sought challenging roles or artistic growth, Reagan appeared satisfied with his steady work in B pictures and seemed unbothered by critical assessments of his limitations. This acceptance of his place in the Hollywood hierarchy reflected an honest self-assessment of his capabilities that would later serve him well when transitioning to politics after his acting prospects diminished. Ronald Reagan's Hollywood career demonstrates how a certain type of limited intelligence, strong verbal skills and memorization, combined with intellectual incuriosity and simplified thinking, could sustain a decent, if unremarkable, acting career. His limitations prevented him from joining the ranks of Hollywood's most respected dramatic actors, but his natural likability and willingness to work within his capabilities ensured steady employment. Ironically, the same intellectual characteristics that constrained his acting would later prove advantageous in his political career, where his ability to communicate simplified concepts with absolute conviction resonated with voters. Judy Holliday. Judy Holliday presents one of Hollywood's most fascinating contradictions. An actress whose most famous role was playing a stereotypical dumb blonde, despite possessing an exceptionally high IQ, reportedly around 172. Born Judith Tuvim, Holliday created one of cinema's most memorable characterizations as Billy Dawn in Born Yesterday, winning an Academy Award for her portrayal of a seemingly dim-witted showgirl who transforms through education and self-discovery. What makes Holliday's case interesting for our examination is how she deliberately leveraged perceptions about intelligence and appearance to create her screen persona, and, more significantly, to navigate one of Hollywood's most challenging periods. During the McCarthy era, when she was called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee about alleged communist sympathies, Holliday reportedly played into expectations about her intelligence, adopting aspects of her Billy Dawn character to appear less threatening and politically aware than she actually was. Holliday's extraordinary performance during her HUAC testimony, where she appeared confused, spoke in a higher voice than normal, and claimed not to understand the implications of questions, demonstrated her profound understanding of how intelligence was perceived, particularly in women. By leaning into stereotypes about feminine intellectual limitations, she effectively protected herself from more aggressive questioning that might have destroyed her career, as it did for many of her contemporaries. On set, directors and co-stars were often startled by the contrast between Holliday's screen persona and her actual intellect. George Cukor, who directed her in Born Yesterday, noted that Holliday would offer insightful analysis of scenes and suggest subtle performance adjustments that significantly improved the film. However, she deliberately maintained a clear separation between her public and private intellectual presentation, understanding that audiences and studio executives were more comfortable with her dumb blonde image. Holliday's exceptional intelligence extended to linguistic abilities. She was fluent in multiple languages and possessed a photographic memory that allowed her to memorize entire scripts after a single reading. These abilities, however, she kept largely hidden from public view, understanding that they didn't align with her marketable screen image. Co-stars like Katharine Hepburn expressed frustration that Holliday's extraordinary intellect remained largely unacknowledged because it contradicted her profitable public persona. The ultimate irony of Holliday's career is that her most celebrated performance involved playing a woman who transitions from intellectual limitation to enlightenment. a journey Holliday herself never needed to make. Yet her profound understanding of how intelligence was perceived, particularly in women, allowed her to craft a performance of such authenticity that audiences and critics fully believed in Billie Dawn's transformation, never suspecting that the actress behind the role possessed one of Hollywood's most formidable intellects. Judy Holliday's case serves as a counterpoint in our exploration. Not someone limited by natural intelligence, but rather someone who deliberately played into perceptions about intellectual limitations for professional and personal protection. Her story highlights how Golden Age Hollywood's expectations about intelligence, particularly for women, created environments where even the most intellectually gifted might find advantage in appearing less intelligent than they actually were. In an industry that often valued appearance over intellect, Holliday's genius lay partly in recognizing when displaying her exceptional intelligence would hinder rather than help her career. Conclusion: the varied intellectual capacities of Golden Age Hollywood stars reveal an industry where traditional intelligence often mattered less than other qualities. Screen presence, physical appearance, or specialized talents like dancing or singing. For actors with genuine intellectual limitations like George Raft, Johnny Weissmuller, or Vera Hruba Ralston, the studio system could create environments that either compensated for these deficiencies or, in some cases, transformed them into marketable characteristics. What's particularly fascinating is how perceptions of intelligence intersected with gender during this era. For women like Lana Turner or Marilyn Monroe, intellectual limitations, real or perceived, often aligned with profitable screen personas, while exceptional intelligence in actresses like Judy Holliday needed to be concealed to maintain career viability. Male actors, conversely, faced different expectations. Limited intellectual capacity in men was more likely to be reframed as straightforward masculinity or unpretentious charm. The stories of these actors challenge our contemporary understanding of intelligence and success. In today's Hollywood, with its emphasis on actors contributing to script development and production decisions, many of these Golden Age stars would likely struggle to establish or maintain careers. Their experiences highlight how drastically industry expectations have shifted, with intellectual engagement now valued alongside or even above the pure screen presence that once sufficed for stardom. Perhaps the most important insight from examining Hollywood's dumbest stars is recognizing the extraordinary adaptability of the human spirit. Individuals with significant intellectual limitations found ways to navigate an intensely competitive industry, developing compensatory strategies that played to their strengths while minimizing their weaknesses. Their successes, despite their limitations, remind us that intelligence takes many forms and that conventional measures of intellect don't always predict achievement or cultural impact. As we watch these Golden Age stars in their classic performances, understanding their intellectual limitations adds another dimension to appreciating their work. Whether it's recognizing George Raft's coin flipping as a brilliant strategy to mask his limited acting range, or seeing how Johnny Weissmuller's minimal dialogue in Tarzan films accommodated his real-life struggles with language, this knowledge enriches our understanding of cinema history and the complex humans behind Hollywood's carefully constructed images. In the final analysis, Hollywood's Golden Age accommodated a remarkable range of intellectual capabilities, finding ways to showcase strengths while concealing limitations. The resulting films, some genuine classics, others memorable primarily for their peculiarities, collectively demonstrate how an industry built on illusion could transform even significant intellectual limitations into marketable entertainment. These stars, brilliant or otherwise, each contributed uniquely to creating the cinematic legacy we continue to celebrate today. Would you like to learn more about any of these Golden Age actors? Or should I explore another aspect of Hollywood history for you?